Empires can be measured in ships and soldiers, but they are sustained by whatever turns uncertainty into order. In the Imperium, that substance was melange. It brightened the eye, lengthened the life, and opened certain minds just enough to see the paths between stars. It made fortunes and famines, saints and tyrants. This is the story of how spice became the hinge of history, and how a desert taught the galaxy what it truly cost. Prologue. The hinge of history. Before the spice, humanity was scattered and adrift. The great diaspora that followed the Butlerian Jihad had sent humankind across the myriad worlds of the known universe. Yet this expansion came at a cost. Without the thinking machines that had once calculated the complex astrogation routes for interstellar travel, space became a vast and treacherous ocean. Journeys were long, uncertain, and perilous. The fabric of a cohesive human empire was stretched thin, threatening to tear apart under the strain of time and distance. Humanity was a collection of isolated islands, each developing in its own way the memory of a shared origin fading into legend. What was needed was a thread to stitch these worlds back together. What was needed was a new kind of sight, one that could look into the tangled futures of gravitational fields and stellar hazards and plot a safe course through them. The discovery of melange, the spice of the planet Arrakis, provided that sight. It was a catalyst, a key that unlocked a potential latent within the human mind. The navigators of the Spacing Guild, immersed in concentrated spice gas, could perceive the pathways of space-time. They could fold space, guiding their massive highliners from one star system to another in an instant. The universe shrank, and a true Imperium became possible. This single substance did more than enable travel. It became the bedrock of the entire Imperial economy. The great houses of the Landsraad, the noble families who governed the planets of the Imperium, vied for control of its source. The Combine Hanate Ober Advancer Mercantiles, or CHOAM, managed its distribution and reaped immense profits. The price of spice could determine the fate of a dynasty. A contract to manage its extraction was a guarantee of wealth beyond measure, but also a target for envy, intrigue, and assassination. The flow of melange was the flow of power, and its control was the ultimate prize in the political arena of the Imperium. The spice also reshaped human biology. Its most common effect was gerontological, extending the natural lifespan by centuries. For the wealthy and powerful, it offered a defense against the ravages of time, allowing them to consolidate their influence over generations. This longevity came with a visible mark: the eyes of the Ibad, a total bluing of the sclera and iris. This was the sign of a diet saturated with spice, a status symbol that declared one's wealth and connection to the universe's most precious commodity. But it also came with a terrible price. Melange was addictive. Once a certain level of consumption was reached, cessation meant death. The spice gave life, but it also demanded absolute loyalty. Beyond the halls of power and the cockpits of starships, the spice wove itself into the deepest structures of human culture and religion. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood used it to heighten their senses, to see the subtle truths hidden in a person's speech and posture. Their reverend mothers underwent a perilous ritual, involving a concentrated form of the spice, to unlock the memories of their female ancestors. On Arrakis itself, the desert planet that was the spice's only source, the native Fremen people revered it as a sacred substance. It was central to their rituals, their diet, and their very way of life. They saw its origins in the great sandworms of the desert, creatures they worshipped as manifestations of their god, Shai-Hulud. This is the story of that substance. It is a story of ecology and economy, of addiction and apotheosis. It examines how a single molecule, produced by a strange and hostile alien life cycle, could become the central pillar of a galactic civilization. It is a history of how humanity, having cast off the yoke of thinking machines, bound itself just as tightly to a psychoactive chemical. From the deep desert of Arrakis to the golden throne of the Padishah Emperor, the story of the Imperium is the story of the spice. It is a tale of how a desire for control, for wealth, for vision, and for life itself drove an entire civilization to depend on a resource it could never truly master. The desert held the key, and it would demand a terrible price for its secrets. Chapter 1: The Desert's Secret. The planet Arrakis, known to its inhabitants as Dune, was a world defined by absence. It lacked visible surface water, lush vegetation, and the gentle climates found on most worlds of the Imperium. Instead, it offered an endless vista of sand, rock, and wind. Its sun was a harsh, unforgiving furnace, capable of killing an unprotected human in minutes. The planet was a study in scarcity, a place where life clung to existence by the thinnest of threads. Yet this desolate world was the single most important planet in the known universe. It was the sole source of melange, the spice that fueled the Imperium. Before its true value was understood, Arrakis was a place of little interest. Imperial surveyors noted its extreme climate and the apparent lack of easily exploitable resources. Early settlements were small, precarious outposts focused on basic survival. The planet was considered a backwater, a hardship post for those who had fallen out of favor or those with a desperate taste for solitude. The native population, the Fremen, were dismissed as scattered hostile nomads, a minor nuisance to be managed rather than a culture to be understood. The great secret of Arrakis was hidden in plain sight, in the very sand that made the world so inhospitable. The first whispers of the spice were likely carried by Zensuni wanderers, the ancestors of the Fremen, who followed their own path of spiritual discovery across the stars. Their beliefs and traditions were shaped by hardship and a deep connection to the environments they inhabited. On Arrakis, they found a world that tested their philosophy to its limits. They learned to survive in the deep desert, adapting their technology and their culture to the unforgiving realities of a world without water. It was during this period of adaptation that they would have first encountered melange. The record is unclear on the precise nature of this first contact, but it was likely a gradual process of observation and cautious experimentation. The Fremen would have noticed the strange, cinnamon-like scent that preceded the appearance of the great sandworms. They would have found patches of the dark, reddish-brown substance on the sand, perhaps after a mysterious, violent upwelling from beneath the surface. In a world where every resource was precious, such a discovery would not have been ignored. They would have tested it, tasted it, and experienced its strange effects. The spice sharpened their senses, heightened their awareness, and in time, they would have noticed its effect on their longevity. It became a part of their diet, a key ingredient in their food and drink, as essential to them as the carefully recycled water in their stillsuits. The initial off-world knowledge of spice was fragmented. Smugglers and rogue traders operating on the fringes of Imperial law were likely the first to carry small quantities of melange away from Arrakis. They would have sold it as a curiosity, a rare drug with unusual properties. The wealthy and decadent of the Imperium, always searching for new sensations, would have paid high prices for this exotic substance. For a time, it remained a secret of the underworld and the elite, its full potential unrealized. The Spacing Guild, at this point still struggling with the immense risks of unguided space travel, would have been among those experimenting with any substance that promised to enhance mental acuity. The turning point came when the connection between spice and prescience was established. The ability of certain individuals, after prolonged and heavy exposure to melange, to see glimpses of the future was the discovery that transformed the Imperium. For the Spacing Guild, this was the solution to their greatest problem. Their navigators, immersed in spice-rich gas, could see the safe paths through the cosmos. They could navigate the treacherous currents of space-time, making interstellar travel fast, safe, and reliable. The Guild's monopoly on space travel was born from this discovery, and their demand for spice became insatiable. With the Guild's demand, the secret of Arrakis was out. The Padishah Emperor and the great houses of the Landsraad turned their full attention to the desert planet. The true value of Melange was no longer in its geriatric properties, but in its strategic necessity. Without spice, the Guild could not navigate. Without the Guild, there was no interstellar travel, no trade, no communication between worlds. The entire structure of the Imperium, from its economy to its military power, depended on a steady supply of this one substance. Arrakis was no longer a backwater. It was the fulcrum of the universe. The control of Arrakis was granted as a fief to a great house, who would be responsible for harvesting the spice and paying a tithe to the Emperor and CHOAM. This was a position of immense wealth and power, but also of great danger. The harvesting of spice was a perilous operation, complicated by the harsh environment and the presence of the giant sandworms that were drawn to any rhythmic activity on the sand. The Fremen, who had lived with the spice for generations, were now seen as an obstacle to industrial-scale extraction. They were pushed to the margins, their sacred connection to the spice ignored by the off-worlders who saw only profit in the sands. Thus, the stage was set for centuries of conflict. The secret of the desert became a commodity, a source of political struggle that would shape the destiny of the Imperium. The great houses would scheme and fight for the right to control Arrakis. The Emperor would play them against each other to maintain his own power. The Spacing Guild would demand its supply, holding the threat of interstellar embargo over any who would disrupt the flow. And in the deep desert, the Fremen watched and waited, their understanding of the spice and the planet far deeper than any of the off-worlders could imagine. They knew that the spice was more than a drug or a commodity. It was a product of the planet's unique and fragile ecology, a life cycle that could not be exploited forever without consequence. The secret of the desert had been revealed, but its true meaning was yet to be understood. Chapter 2. From Plankton to Leviathan. The existence of Melange was inextricably linked to the life cycle of the giant sandworms of Arrakis. To understand the spice was to understand these creatures, from their microscopic origins to their final, colossal form. The Fremen knew this truth intimately, weaving it into their religion and their daily lives. They called the sandworms Shai-Hulud, the old man of the desert, and treated them with a mixture of reverence and fear. The off-worlders, in their haste to extract the spice, saw the worms primarily as a dangerous obstacle to harvesting. For a long time, the true biological connection between worm and spice remained a mystery to the Imperium's scientists, a puzzle that only the desert dwellers had solved. The cycle begins not in the sand, but with microscopic creatures that the Fremen called sand plankton. These tiny organisms float through the arid atmosphere of Arrakis, feeding on residual atmospheric chemicals and trace elements found in the dust. They are the foundation of the planet's strange food chain, a primary producer in an ecosystem with almost no water. The sandworms, as they move through the desert, filter vast quantities of sand and dust through their bodies, consuming the plankton as their primary food source. This simple act of feeding is the first step in the complex process that creates Melange. The next stage of the life cycle is the sandtrout. These creatures are the larval form of the sandworms, and they are crucial to the ecological transformation of Arrakis. The Fremen called them water stealers, a name that perfectly describes their function. Sandtrout are small, diamond-shaped creatures with a tough, leathery skin. They are driven by an instinct to find and encapsulate any trace of water they can detect. They will swarm over moist ground, linking their bodies together to form a living barrier that seals the water away from the dry surface. This hoarding of water is what made Arrakis a desert planet. In the distant past, the planet had surface water, but the introduction of the sandtrout life form led to its complete desertification. When a sandtrout encounters a sufficiently large quantity of water, a chemical reaction is triggered within its body. This reaction is exothermic and violent. A group of sandtrout, upon finding a deep source of water, will begin a process that leads to the creation of a pre-spice mass. The water they have hoarded is mixed with their own metabolic excretions, creating a rich chemical soup in a pocket deep beneath the sand. This mass grows and ferments, building up immense pressure. Eventually, this pressure becomes too great to contain. The result is a spice blow, one of the most dramatic and dangerous events in the Arrakis desert. The pre-spice mass erupts from beneath the sand with explosive force, throwing vast quantities of sand and dust high into the atmosphere. The material ejected in this explosion is a mixture of sand and raw, unrefined melange. The intense heat and pressure of the blow, combined with exposure to the air and sun, transform the volatile chemicals into the mature spice. The characteristic cinnamon scent of melange fills the air for kilometers around, a signal that a new deposit of the precious substance is ready for harvesting. The spice blow serves two purposes in the life cycle. First, it disperses the melange onto the desert surface where it can be collected. Second, it is a crucial part of the sandworm's reproductive process. Of the many sandtrout involved in the creation of the pre-spice mass, most are destroyed in the explosion. However, a few survive, and these are transformed by the experience. They enter a dormant hibernatory state, becoming small, larval worms. These stunned creatures, if left undisturbed, will eventually grow into the giant sandworms that dominate the planet. It is a cycle of immense scale, where millions of larval forms sacrifice themselves to create the conditions for a few to reach maturity. The mature sandworm, or Shai-Hulud, is a creature of awe-inspiring size. They can grow to be hundreds of meters long, their bodies composed of a series of rings, each with its own rudimentary nervous system. Their mouths are vast, crystalline maws, capable of swallowing an entire spice harvester whole. They are drawn to rhythmic vibrations, an instinct that developed to hunt the small desert creatures that were their original prey. On modern Arrakis, this instinct drew them to the activities of spice miners, making harvesting a deadly gamble. The worms are also fiercely territorial, attacking any other worm that enters their domain. The worms are not merely a byproduct of the spice cycle. They are its stewards. As they travel through the desert, they consume the sand plankton that are the base of the food chain. Their internal chemistry processes these plankton and other organic materials, producing the chemical precursors that the sandtrout will later use to create the pre-spice mass. The worm's excretions are rich in the necessary compounds. Thus, the great worm itself is an integral part of the spice's creation, not just its guardian. It is a true symbiotic relationship, where the larval form creates the spice that sustains the ecosystem that feeds the mature form. This delicate, interconnected cycle is extremely vulnerable to one thing: water. The mature sandworms are fatally poisoned by contact with large amounts of water. It is a deep, biological aversion. A drowning worm will writhe in agony, its body breaking down in a catastrophic metabolic failure. This vulnerability is a direct consequence of their origins. The sandtrout, their larval form, are creatures designed to encapsulate and isolate water. The mature form retains this fundamental opposition to it. The entire ecology of Arrakis, the very system that produces the most valuable substance in the universe, is predicated on the absolute scarcity of water. This fact would have profound implications for anyone who sought to change the face of the planet, and it was the key to a power greater than the spice itself. Chapter 3: Water, Death, and Transformation. The Fremen relationship with water was one of profound contradiction. They lived in a state of absolute scarcity, where every drop was sacred. Their culture, their laws, and their technology were all designed to conserve and control this precious resource. Yet they also possessed a secret knowledge of water's destructive power. a power linked to the deepest mysteries of the spice and the sandworms. They understood that the element they most craved was also the deadliest poison to the god of their desert world, Shai-Hulud. This knowledge gave them a unique form of leverage, and it was the basis for one of their most sacred and dangerous rituals, the creation of the water of life. The process began with the deliberate drowning of a small, young sandworm. The Fremen would capture a worm of about 9 meters in length, a juvenile specimen that was large enough to possess the necessary chemistry, but small enough to be handled. They would corral it into a deep pit or a specially constructed cistern and then flood the enclosure with water. The worm's death was a violent, convulsive event. As its body was overwhelmed by the liquid poison, it would exude a clear, blue-tinged fluid. This was the raw, undiluted bile of the sandworm, a substance of extreme toxicity. This liquid was the water of life. In its raw form, the water of life was a deadly poison to humans as well. To consume it was to invite a swift and agonizing death. However, the Bene Gesserit sisterhood had long sought a way to transform such a poison, a substance they called a spectrum narcotic, into a tool for expanding consciousness. Their own process involved carefully synthesized chemicals, but on Arrakis, they found a natural equivalent of immense power. A Bene Gesserit, trained in the control of her own internal chemistry, could, with great effort and risk, metabolize the water of life. She could neutralize its poisonous elements and change it into a substance that could be safely consumed. This act of transformation was the central ordeal of the Fremen CH rituals. A Sayadina, a Fremen priestess, often with Bene Gesserit training, would take the poison into her body. She would enter a deep trance, a near-death state, in which she had to consciously alter the chemical structure of the substance within her. If she succeeded, she would emerge from the ordeal transformed. The process would unlock the memories of her female ancestors, granting her access to a vast store of knowledge and experience. She would become a reverend mother, a leader, and a spiritual guide for her people. The transformed liquid, now safe for consumption, was then shared with the rest of the CH community in a carefully controlled ritual. This communal sharing of the water of life created a powerful bond between the members of the tribe. It was an orgiastic, trance-like state, where the boundaries between individual consciousnesses would blur. The spice essence within the liquid heightened their senses and created a deep sense of shared identity and purpose. This ritual was the core of Fremen's social cohesion, reinforcing their loyalty to the tribe and their shared reverence for the mysteries of the desert. The ecological implications of this process were significant. The Fremen understood that water was the key to controlling the sandworms and, by extension, the spice. Their ability to create the water of life demonstrated their mastery over the fundamental forces of their world. This was a power the off-worlders did not possess and could not comprehend. While the Harkonnens and other rulers of Arrakis saw the desert as a factory floor for spice production, the Fremen saw it as a complex, living system that could be influenced and even controlled. This knowledge also contained the seeds of a profound threat to the existing order. The Fremen dream, whispered in the privacy of their seches, was to one day terraform Arrakis, to bring water back to the surface and make the desert bloom. They carefully collected water in vast underground reservoirs, hoarding it against the day when they would have enough to change the planet's climate. Yet they knew this dream came with a terrible cost. To bring water to Arrakis would be to destroy the sandworms. It would mean the end of the spice cycle. The very act that would fulfill their deepest cultural yearning would also destroy the source of the Imperium's power and their own sacred substance. This paradox was at the heart of the Fremen dilemma. They held the power to destroy the thing the galaxy valued most. For generations, they kept this knowledge a closely guarded secret, using it only for their own rituals. They understood that to reveal it would be to invite their own destruction. The Imperium would never allow the source of Melange to be threatened. The Spacing Guild, the Emperor, and the great houses would unite to crush any group that posed such an existential risk to their power. The Fremen, therefore, had to live a double life, appearing to be simple nomads while secretly holding the key to the planet's ecology. The water of life was more than just a ritual substance. It was a symbol of the Fremen's unique position. They were the only people who understood the deep connection between water, death, and transformation on Arrakis. They knew how to turn the planet's greatest poison into a source of enlightenment. They knew that the death of a worm could give new life to their community. And they knew that the dream of bringing water to their world was also a dream of apocalyptic change, not just for their planet, but for the entire galactic empire that depended on its arid sands. This secret knowledge, passed down through generations of reverend mothers, was a weapon waiting to be used. Chapter 4. Physiology of Spice. Melange was desirable for many reasons, but its most profound impact was on the human body itself. It was not merely a drug that altered perception. It was a substance that fundamentally changed the user's biology, from the cellular level to the span of their life. The effects were varied, ranging from the cosmetic to the essential, but all came with the same underlying condition: addiction. The spice offered gifts of time, awareness, and vitality, but in return it demanded a lifelong commitment. To understand the power of Melange is to understand how it captured and reshaped the human form. The most widely known effect of a spice-rich diet was its geriatric property. Melange acted as a powerful antioxidant and metabolic preservative, dramatically slowing the aging process. Individuals with regular access to the spice could live for centuries, maintaining their physical and mental faculties far beyond a normal human lifespan. This effect was the foundation of the wealth and stability of the great houses and the imperial court. It allowed rulers and influential figures to accumulate knowledge and power over vast stretches of time, creating dynasties that were as much biological as they were political. The pursuit of longevity was a primary driver of the initial demand for spice among the elite. This extended life came with a telltale sign: the eyes of the Ibad. Prolonged consumption of melange caused a metabolic saturation that permanently dyed the sclera and iris of the eyes a deep, uniform blue, with no white visible. This was not a harmful side effect, but it was an unmistakable marker of a spice user. In the Imperium, blue in blue eyes became a symbol of wealth and status. It was a visible declaration that an individual had access to the universe's most valuable commodity. For the Fremen of Arrakis, whose diet was completely saturated with spice from birth, the eyes of the Ibad were a universal trait, a mark of their unique bond with the planet. Beyond longevity, the spice also had a significant effect on mental acuity. Even in small doses, it sharpened the senses and enhanced awareness. Users often reported a feeling of clarity, of being more connected to their surroundings. This effect was highly valued in a universe where subtle cues and hidden intentions could mean the difference between life and death. The Bene Gesserit, in particular, relied on this property to augment their highly developed skills of observation and intuition. For them, spice was a tool that helped them perceive the minute, almost invisible truths that governed human interaction. In much higher concentrations, such as those used by the Spacing Guild navigators, the spice could unlock the power of prescience. This was not true clairvoyance in the sense of seeing a single determined future. Rather, it was a form of limited precognition that allowed the user to see the paths of probability, the safe routes through the chaotic tangle of space-time. The navigator, immersed in a tank of highly concentrated orange spice gas, did not pilot a ship in the traditional sense. Instead, he chose a path of safety, a corridor through the future where the ship would not encounter a fatal obstacle. This ability was the absolute foundation of interstellar travel and the Guild's monopoly. It was the most extreme and most valuable physiological effect of the spice. However, all these benefits came with a severe and inescapable drawback: addiction. The human body, once it became accustomed to the presence of melange, could not function without it. The spice integrated itself into the most basic cellular processes. Withdrawal was not a matter of discomfort or craving. It was a fatal condition. If a user accustomed to a certain level of spice consumption was deprived of it, they would experience a rapid and catastrophic breakdown of their system. The process was agonizing and irreversible, leading to death in a matter of days or weeks. This addiction was a powerful tool of control. The sparing guild's reliance on spice gave it immense power, but it also made the guild utterly dependent on the supply from Arrakis. The emperor and the great houses used the promise of spice to ensure loyalty and the threat of its withdrawal to punish dissent. An entire political and economic system was built on this shared biological dependency. Everyone in a position of power, from the Padishah emperor himself to the lowest-ranking functionary of a great house, was likely to be addicted. Their personal survival was tied directly to the political stability of the Imperium and the continued flow of melange. The Fremen of Arrakis represented the ultimate expression of this biological bond. They were exposed to spice from the moment of conception. It was in their food, their water, and the very air they breathed. Their bodies were so saturated with it that their blood and other bodily fluids had a distinct cinnamon scent. This lifelong exposure gave them enhanced strength, stamina, and sensory perception, making them formidable warriors, perfectly adapted to their harsh environment. But it also meant that they could not survive for long outside of the spice-rich atmosphere of Arrakis. Their addiction was total, binding them to their planet as surely as its gravity. The physiology of spice, therefore, was a double-edged sword. It offered the gifts that the powerful of the Imperium craved most: a long life to wield their power, and for some, the vision to see the paths of the future. But it also created a universal vulnerability, a biological chain that bound every user to the fate of a single desert planet. The quest for melange was not just a quest for wealth. It was a quest for life itself. This desperation shaped the politics, the warfare, and the very soul of the civilization built upon it. Chapter 5. Fremen and the Law of Water. On Arrakis, life was governed by a single, unyielding law, the law of water. For the Fremen, the desert people who knew the planet's secrets, water was more than a substance necessary for survival. It was the measure of all things. It was the basis of their currency, their social structure, and their deepest ethical codes. Their relationship with water was a complex tapestry of extreme conservation, communal responsibility, and sacred ritual. This relationship was the key to their survival in the harshest environment known to humanity, and it was a reality that the off-world rulers of Arrakis consistently failed to comprehend. The foundation of Fremen life was the stillsuit, a masterpiece of microtechnology designed for total water reclamation. The suit was a full-body filtration and recycling system, designed to capture all the moisture produced by the wearer's body. Perspiration, urine, and the moisture from exhalation were all collected, purified, and made available for drinking through a tube at the neck. A properly fitted and maintained stillsuit could allow a person to survive for weeks in the open desert on only the water their body produced. It was a closed system, a personal microcosm that mirrored the Fremen's desire to create a closed ecological system for their entire planet. The efficiency of a stillsuit was a matter of life and death, and its maintenance was a discipline drilled into every Fremen from birth. The fit had to be precise, the seals perfect. The rhythmic cadence of walking in the desert was adapted to the pumping action of the suit's reclamation mechanisms. To waste water was the greatest sin. Spitting, for example, was a gesture of profound respect, a willingness to give a part of one's own life essence to another. Tears were a gift to the dead, a sign of a grief so profound that one would give up a portion of their water. This focus on water conservation extended from the individual to the community. In the CH, the underground warrens where the Fremen lived, every drop was accounted for. The dead were not buried in the ground, as that would waste the water in their bodies. Instead, their bodies were rendered down in a death still, and their water was added to the communal cisterns. This was not seen as a gruesome act, but as a final contribution to the tribe. The water of a fallen comrade became the life of the community, a literal embodiment of the idea that the tribe was a single, continuous organism. A person's worth to the tribe could be measured by the amount of water they carried in their flesh. Water also served as the basis of the Fremen economy. They used water rings of various sizes as a form of currency and as markers for debts and obligations. A person's wealth was measured not in the imperial currency of Solaris, but in the amount of water they controlled or had claim to. This system was incomprehensible to the off-worlders, who saw Arrakis as a place of vast, extractable wealth in the form of spice. The Fremen saw the planet's true wealth in the hidden cisterns and caches of water they had been secretly accumulating for generations. The law of water also shaped their social and political structures. The leader of a CH was the one who was strongest, the one who could best protect the tribe and its water. Disputes were often settled by ritual combat to the death. The victor would claim the water of the vanquished for the tribe. This was a harsh code, but it ensured that the tribe was always led by a capable warrior, and that the precious resource of the fallen was not lost. The rules of hospitality were also bound by water. A visitor to a CH would be offered water, a gesture of immense trust. How that water was treated, whether it was accepted, refused, or spilled, would carry deep social significance. The Fremen's mastery of water was directly linked to their relationship with the spice. Their diet, saturated with melange, gave them the physical prowess and heightened senses needed to survive the desert. But it was their water discipline that allowed them to live in the deep desert, far from the prying eyes of their Harkonnen rulers. They could travel for great distances, appearing and disappearing like ghosts, because they were not tied to the water sources that constrained the off-worlders. This freedom of movement made them a potent guerrilla force. Their ultimate goal, the great dream of terraforming Arrakis, was a project of water. The planetary ecologist, Pardo Kynes, and later his son Leet Kynes, gave this dream a scientific framework. They showed the Fremen how to plant grasses in the high latitudes to build up humus and trap moisture, how to create wind traps to condense the dew from the morning air. Every Siege contributed to this secret project, slowly and patiently building the water reserves needed to one day transform their world. This project was the ultimate expression of the law of water, a plan to use their hoarded resource to reshape their planet's destiny. This deep, cultural obsession with water was the Fremen's greatest strength and their most profound secret. The Harkonnens and the other off-worlders saw them as primitive nomads because they did not value the things the Imperium valued. They did not build grand cities or accumulate Solaris. But the Fremen were playing a different game, a longer game, measured in generations and based on the fundamental element of life. They knew that whoever controlled the water on Arrakis ultimately controlled the planet itself, and by extension, the spice. Their laws were not written in books, but in the careful, life-giving discipline of every drop. Chapter 6. Harvest at the Edge of Disaster. The extraction of melange from the sands of Arrakis was one of the most complex and dangerous industrial operations in the Imperium. It was a high-stakes gamble against the planet's unforgiving environment and its monstrous inhabitants. The process required a symphony of specialized machinery and highly skilled personnel, all working in perfect coordination under immense pressure. A successful harvest brought unimaginable wealth, but a single mistake could lead to the loss of equipment worth a small fortune, and, more importantly, the lives of the crew. The entire operation was a race against time, a battle between human technology and the raw, untamable power of the desert. The key piece of equipment was the spice harvester, a colossal, mobile factory designed to process vast quantities of sand. These machines, sometimes called crawlers, were several hundred meters long and dozens of meters high. They moved across the desert on huge independent tracks, scooping up the spice-rich sand and filtering it through a complex series of separators. The raw melange was extracted and stored, while the processed sand was ejected in a plume behind the machine. The harvester was a self-contained industrial plant, a metal island in the vast ocean of the desert. Its operation required a large crew of technicians, engineers, and workers. A harvester never worked alone. It was the centerpiece of a team. The most important support vehicle was the carryall, a massive ornithopter capable of lifting the entire harvester and flying it to safety. The carryall would transport the harvester to a spice-rich area that had been identified by aerial surveys. It would deposit the machine on the sand and then circle high above, acting as a lookout and a lifeline. The connection between the harvester and its carryall was absolute. The survival of the harvester crew depended entirely on the vigilance and readiness of the carryall pilots. The process began with the identification of a spice blow. After a pre-spice mass erupted, it would leave a large, dark patch of melange-infused sand on the surface. Spotter aircraft would patrol the desert, searching for these telltale signs. Once a promising site was located, the carryall would be dispatched with a harvester. The crawler would be set down and would immediately begin its work, its huge scoops digging into the sand, its internal machinery humming with activity. The crew on board would monitor the purity of the spice being collected, maximizing their efficiency in the limited time they had. The greatest danger came from the sandworms. The rhythmic, repetitive vibrations of a working harvester were an irresistible lure to the territorial creatures. A worm could sense the vibrations from many kilometers away and would move to investigate and attack the source. This was known as worm sign. The appearance of worm sign was the signal that the harvest had to end immediately. Lookouts, both in the air and on the ground, were constantly scanning the horizon for the characteristic V-shaped plume of sand that indicated an approaching worm. Once worm sign was confirmed, a frantic race against the clock began. The harvester crew had to shut down their operations, secure their equipment, and prepare for extraction. The carryall pilots would receive the signal and begin their descent. This was the most critical phase of the operation. The carryall had to attach its lifting cables to the harvester and lift it clear of the sand before the worm arrived. A miscalculation in timing, a mechanical failure in the carryall, or a sudden sandstorm could spell doom for the entire crew. The sandworm would not be deterred. It would swallow the harvester whole, the immense machine disappearing into its crystalline maw as if it were a minor inconvenience. The loss of a harvester was a significant financial blow to whichever great house was managing Arrakis. The machines were incredibly expensive to build and transport. But the real cost was in the disruption to the spice supply. Every lost harvester meant a reduction in the flow of melange to the Imperium, a failure that would have political and economic repercussions. The system was designed with built-in protocols for rescue and failure. If a carryall failed, for example, there were supposed to be backup vehicles that could be scrambled to attempt a last-minute rescue. However, under the brutal and cost-cutting regime of the Harkonnens, these safety measures were often neglected. Maintenance was deferred, and rescue teams were underfunded. For the workers on the harvesters, this meant that they were considered expendable. The cost of their lives was weighed against the cost of the spice they were collecting, and often, the balance did not tip in their favor. The entire process was a reflection of the Imperium's attitude towards Arrakis. The planet was seen as a resource to be exploited, not a world to be understood. The technology was impressive, a testament to human ingenuity, but it was a technology of brute force, designed to extract wealth from a hostile environment as quickly as possible, with little regard for the consequences. The harvest was a constant battle, a state of perpetual emergency. The men and women who worked the spice fields lived on the edge of disaster, their lives dependent on the reliability of their machines. and the cold calculus of their superiors. They were the frontline soldiers in the economic war for control of the universe, and the desert was an unforgiving battlefield. Chapter 7. Smugglers and Shadow Markets. Where there is a monopoly, there will always be a black market. The tight control that the Imperium, through CHOAM and the ruling house of Arrakis, exerted over the spice trade created a powerful incentive for smuggling. The official price of melange was kept artificially high by controlling the supply. This meant that any amount of spice that could be acquired outside of the official channels could be sold for an immense profit. A shadow economy of smugglers, rogue traders, and secret buyers existed in the margins of the Imperium, a constant challenge to the established order. The smugglers of Arrakis were a diverse group, united only by their willingness to take incredible risks for the promise of wealth. Many were former spice workers, pilots, or technicians who had grown disillusioned with the brutal conditions and low pay of the official harvesting operations. They used their insider knowledge of the terrain and the harvesting process to their advantage. Others were off-world adventurers, criminals, and political dissidents, drawn to the one place in the universe where a fortune could be made by defying the authorities. Their methods were as varied as their backgrounds. The most common tactic was to establish secret, small-scale harvesting operations in the deep desert, far from the prying eyes of Harkonnen patrols. They would use salvaged or stolen equipment, often modified for quick setup and escape. These operations were incredibly dangerous. They lacked the protection of a dedicated carryall, so they had to be constantly vigilant for worm sign. A smuggler's harvester was often a stripped-down, makeshift affair, and a single mechanical failure could leave the crew stranded and at the mercy of the desert. Another common method was to bribe or coerce workers within the official harvesting system. A few kilograms of spice siphoned from a harvester's hold before it was officially logged could be a life-changing amount of money for a low-level technician. These small-scale thefts, multiplied across the entire planet, could add up to a significant amount of unaccounted-for spice. The Harkonnens, with their characteristic brutality, frequently made examples of those caught stealing, but the temptation was often too great to resist. Getting the spice off-planet was the next great challenge. Arrakis was under the tight control of the ruling house, and all off-going transport was supposed to be carefully monitored. The Spacing Guild, while officially neutral, cooperated with the authorities to prevent unauthorized shipments on their highliners. Smugglers, therefore, had to find ways around this security. They would use secret landing fields in remote parts of the desert, often paying exorbitant fees to non-guild pilots who were willing to risk running the blockade. They would hide the spice in disguised cargo containers or bribe spaceport officials to look the other way. The existence of a thriving black market had a significant impact on the official spice trade. The authorities on Arrakis, particularly the Harkonnens, were caught in a difficult position. They were under constant pressure from the Emperor and CHOAM to meet their production quotas and to crack down on smuggling. However, the smugglers also provided a useful service. The Harkonnens themselves were not above dealing in the shadow markets, using smuggled spice for their own off-the-books operations or to build their private stockpiles. A certain level of smuggling was tolerated, as long as it did not seriously threaten the overall production numbers. It was a complex game of cat and mouse, where the lines between law enforcement and criminal activity were often blurred. The primary buyers in the shadow markets were those who could not or would not acquire spice through official channels. This included renegade great houses planning secret military buildups, wealthy individuals seeking to hide their assets from Imperial tax collectors, and fringe political or religious groups. The black market provided a layer of anonymity that was impossible to find in the heavily regulated official market. For these buyers, the higher price and greater risk of smuggled spice was a worthwhile trade-off for the secrecy it afforded. The Fremen also played a role in this shadow economy. For generations, they had harvested spice for their own use. They had their own methods, far more subtle and efficient than the clumsy industrial techniques of the off-worlders. They knew how to read the desert, how to find the richest spice deposits, and how to work in harmony with the rhythms of the planet. They would often trade small amounts of spice to the smugglers in exchange for weapons, technology, or other goods they could not produce themselves. This trade was a crucial part of their long-term plan for resistance. The Solaris they earned were used to bribe guild officials and to purchase the materials needed for their terraforming project. The smugglers, in turn, often acted as unwitting agents of the Fremen cause. They created a network of secret contacts and transportation routes that the Fremen could later use for their own purposes. They provided a crack in the armor of Imperial control, a demonstration that the authority of the ruling house was not absolute. The shadow market was more than just a criminal enterprise. It was a symptom of the underlying instability of the spice economy. It showed that a system based on the strict control of a single, universally desired resource was inherently fragile and prone to corruption. The smugglers operated in the darkness, but their actions had a profound effect on the balance of power in the light. Chapter 8. CHOAM and the Price of Empire. The Combine Honete Ober Advancer Mercantiles, universally known as CHOAM, was the most powerful economic entity in the Imperium. It was a vast, sprawling conglomerate that controlled the wealth of the entire galaxy. While it had interests in countless industries across thousands of planets, its power and influence stemmed from one primary source: its control over the distribution and sale of melange. CHOAM was the engine of the imperial economy, and the spice was its fuel. To understand CHOAM was to understand how profit became policy, and how the fate of worlds was decided on a balance sheet. On the surface, CHOAM was a joint stock company. Its directorships and shares were controlled by the Padishah Emperor and the great houses of the Landsraad, with the Spacing Guild and the Bene Gesserit as silent partners. The Emperor held the largest single block of shares, which was a key pillar of his power. The great houses held the rest, with the number of shares and directorships they controlled being a direct measure of their political and economic influence. A seat on the board of CHOAM was a prize of immense value, granting a house a say in the direction of the galactic economy and a significant share of its profits. The primary function of CHOAM was to manage the interstellar trade of essential commodities, but all of its other activities were dwarfed by its role in the spice market. The great house that held the fief of Arrakis was responsible for harvesting the spice, but they did so under contract to CHOAM. They were required to sell their entire output to the company at a fixed price. CHOAM would then take this spice, transport it via the Spacing Guild, and sell it to buyers throughout the Imperium at a much higher price. The difference between the buying and selling price was the source of CHOAM's enormous profits. These profits were then distributed to the shareholders in the form of dividends. This system created a powerful incentive for the great houses to cooperate within the CHOAM framework. A house's wealth was directly tied to the overall profitability of the company. This shared economic interest was one of the key stabilizing forces in the Imperium, tempering the constant political rivalries of the Landsraad. Open warfare between houses was discouraged, not just by the articles of the Great Convention, but by the fact that it was bad for business. A war that disrupted trade would lower CHOAM profits and hurt everyone's bottom line. However, this system also created intense competition for control within the company. The struggle for CHOAM directorships was a central feature of the political landscape. A house with more directors had more say in setting prices, awarding contracts, and shaping the company's long-term strategy. These struggles were rarely fought on the battlefield. Instead, they were waged through complex economic maneuvering, political alliances, assassination, and sabotage. The goal was to weaken a rival house to the point where it could be forced to sell its CHOAM shares or cede its directorships. The Emperor used his position as the largest shareholder to maintain his power over the great houses. He could use his influence on the board to reward loyal houses with favorable contracts or to punish rebellious ones with economic sanctions. The threat of being cut out of the CHOAM profit stream was a powerful tool for ensuring compliance with the will of the Golden Throne. The emperor's relationship with CHOAM was symbiotic. His political authority was backed by his economic power, and the stability of the CHOAM monopoly was guaranteed by his military might. The pricing of spice was a delicate balancing act. CHOAM had to set a price that was high enough to generate massive profits, but not so high that it would stifle demand or encourage a dangerous level of black market activity. The price had to be low enough for the Spacing Guild to afford the vast quantities it needed for navigation, as the Guild's ability to function was essential for CHOAM's own business. The company employed armies of economists and analysts to constantly monitor the market and adjust the price as needed. A sudden price shock in the spice market could send ripples throughout the entire galactic economy, potentially leading to political instability. The transfer of the Arrakis fief from House Harkonnen to House Atreides was a classic example of CHOAM politics in action. On the surface, it appeared to be a great opportunity for the Atreides. In reality, it was a complex trap, orchestrated by the Emperor in collusion with the Harkonnens. The Emperor felt threatened by the growing popularity of Duke Leto Atreides and sought to remove him. The Arrakis fief was the bait. The Harkonnens had secretly run down the harvesting equipment and antagonized the local population, leaving a situation that was far more costly and dangerous than the official record showed. The Emperor and the Harkonnens knew that the Atreides would be unable to meet their CHOAM quotas, which would provide the legal pretext for an attack. The entire affair was framed in the language of contracts and profit margins, a political assassination disguised as a corporate takeover. CHOAM was, therefore, more than just a company. It was the arena where the great powers of the Imperium competed for dominance. Its rules and regulations provided a framework that channeled the violent ambitions of the great houses into a more manageable, if no less ruthless, form of economic warfare. The spice was the ultimate prize, and CHOAM was the institution that formalized its value. It turned a psychoactive fungus into the foundation of an empire, ensuring that as long as the spice flowed, the money would flow with it, binding the fates of all the great houses to the fortunes of a single, powerful corporation. Chapter 9. The Spacing Guild's Bargain. The Spacing Guild was perhaps the most enigmatic and powerful of the great institutions of the Imperium. It held an absolute monopoly on all interstellar travel and transport. No ship could travel between star systems without a guild navigator on board. This monopoly was not based on military strength or economic might in the traditional sense. It was based on a unique biological adaptation, a secret that the guild guarded more jealously than any other: the ability of its navigators to achieve limited prescience through massive exposure to melange. The guild's bargain was simple. In exchange for its monopoly, it provided the safe, instantaneous travel that held the Imperium together. The origins of the guild are shrouded in secrecy, but it emerged in the era after the Butlerian Jihad, when humanity was struggling to reconnect its scattered worlds without the aid of thinking machines. Early space travel was slow, dangerous, and unreliable. Ships were lost, and colonies were isolated. The guild's founders discovered that certain individuals, when immersed in a high concentration of spice gas, could perceive the flow of time and space. They could see the safe paths, the routes that would avoid gravitational hazards, rogue asteroids, and other stellar phenomena. They learned to fold space, to guide a ship from one point in the universe to another, without traversing the physical distance between them. This ability transformed human civilization. The vastness of space was conquered. A journey that might have taken generations was now completed in an instant. Trade, communication, and military deployment could happen at a speed that was previously unimaginable. The Imperium as a unified political entity was only possible because of the Guild. The Emperor, the Landsraad, and CHOAM all depended on the Guild's services to maintain their power and influence. The Guild, in turn, remained scrupulously neutral in the political affairs of its clients. Its only concern was that the spice continued to flow, and that no one interfered with its operations. The price of this ability was a profound physical transformation. The navigators, over years of exposure to spice gas, mutated into strange, non-human forms. They became large, vaguely aquatic creatures, their bodies atrophying from lack of use, their limbs becoming elongated fins or flippers. They lived their entire lives inside vast tanks, filled with the brilliant orange gas of concentrated melange. They were utterly dependent on this environment for their survival and for their prescient abilities. They had sacrificed their humanity to become the eyes of the Imperium. The Guild's demand for spice was astronomical. They were the single largest consumer of melange in the universe. Their need was so great that it dictated the entire scale of the harvesting operations on Arrakis. Any threat to the spice supply was a threat to the Guild's very existence. For this reason, the Guild maintained a powerful, if subtle, influence over the politics of Arrakis. They would never take direct control of the planet, as this would violate their principle of neutrality. However, they would use their power to ensure that no single faction could disrupt the flow. Their ultimate weapon was the embargo. The Guild could refuse to transport the troops or goods of any house, or even of the Emperor himself. It could isolate a planet or an entire star system, cutting it off from the rest of the galaxy. This was a threat they rarely had to make, as its implications were so devastating that no power could afford to risk it. The Guild's bargain created a delicate balance of power. The Emperor and the great houses controlled the source of the spice on Arrakis. The Guild controlled the means of its distribution and, by extension, the means of all interstellar commerce and warfare. Each side was dependent on the other. The houses needed the Guild to export their spice and import the goods they needed. The Guild needed the houses to keep the spice harvesters running. This mutual dependency created a state of tense equilibrium. The navigators' prescience also had a profound effect on the nature of risk and planning in the Imperium. Because they could see the safest paths, they made space travel almost perfectly reliable. This predictability was the bedrock of the CHOAM economic model. It allowed for the creation of complex, galaxy-spanning supply chains. It meant that contracts could be signed, and futures could be traded, with a high degree of confidence. The Guild did not just sell transportation. It sold certainty. In a universe filled with political intrigue and sudden violence, this was a commodity of incalculable value. However, the navigators' vision was limited. They could see the paths of physical safety, but they could not see the future of human action with perfect clarity. They could be surprised by sudden political shifts, or by the actions of individuals who were hidden from their prescient sight. This was a critical vulnerability. A person with a more powerful or more focused form of prescience could, in theory, hide their actions from the Guild. They could move without being seen, plan without being anticipated. The existence of such an individual would represent an existential threat to the Guild's monopoly and the stability of the Imperium. The Spacing Guild, therefore, was a paradox. It was the force that held the universe together, yet it was utterly dependent on a single, fragile ecological cycle on one desert planet. Its members were the most powerful beings in the galaxy, capable of seeing the future, yet they were prisoners in their own spice-filled tanks, their bodies twisted into inhuman forms. They had made a bargain to trade their humanity for a form of divinity, and in doing so, they had bound the entire human race to the fate of the spice. Theirs was a power both absolute and precarious, a constant reminder that the order of the Imperium rested on a strange and terrible foundation. Chapter 10. Bene Gesserit and the Politics of Vision. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood operated in the shadows of the Imperium, wielding a form of power that was more subtle, yet often more effective, than the armies and treasuries of the great houses. They were a school of mental and physical discipline, a quasi-religious order that had spent thousands of years honing the human body and mind to the peak of its potential. Their influence was felt in every corner of the galaxy, from the bedrooms of the Imperial court to the religious myths of forgotten planets. At the heart of their power, and their greatest secret, was their use of melange to unlock the deepest capabilities of the human consciousness. The Sisterhood used spice as a tool for enhancing their already formidable abilities. A Bene Gesserit, trained in the ways of prana bindu, the precise control of her own muscles and nerves, could use a small amount of spice to heighten her senses to an incredible degree. She could detect the minute changes in a person's body language, the subtle inflections in their voice that would betray their true intentions. This made them the most effective truth-sayers in the Imperium. No one could lie to a Bene Gesserit who was using the spice to augment her perceptions. This ability made them indispensable advisors in the courts of the powerful, giving them access to the secrets and plans of the great houses and the Emperor himself. However, the Sisterhood's most profound use of the spice was in the dangerous ritual that created their Reverend Mothers. This ordeal involved a carefully administered dose of a spectrum narcotic, a substance that was lethal to an untrained person. On Arrakis, they discovered a natural and far more powerful version of this substance in the water of life. A Bene Gesserit acolyte would take this poison into her body and, using her intense internal control, neutralize it and render it harmless. The shock of this experience, the brush with death, would unlock a new level of awareness. The successful candidate would gain access to her other memory, the complete, lived experiences of all of her female ancestors. This was not a vague, dreamlike recollection, but a full, conscious awareness of thousands of lives. A Reverend Mother contained a multitude of consciousnesses within her own, a vast library of human history and experience that she could consult at any time. This gave the Bene Gesserit an unparalleled understanding of human nature, of history, and of the long-term patterns of political power. Their plans were not measured in years or decades, but in centuries and millennia. This power had a significant limitation. They could only access the memories of their female ancestors. The male side of their genetic history was a dark, empty space in their consciousness, a terrifying void that they could not enter. The Sisterhood's ultimate goal, the secret purpose behind all of their political maneuvering, was to breed a male Bene Gesserit, the Kwisatz Haderach. This individual would be able to bridge that gap, to see both the male and female ancestral memories. He would be a being of immense power, able to see the full tapestry of human history and, they believed, to look into the future with a clarity that even the guild navigators could not match. The Kwisatz Haderach breeding program was the Sisterhood's great, secret project. For thousands of years, they had carefully arranged political marriages between the great houses, subtly guiding the genetic lines of the nobility towards their desired outcome. They were the master puppeteers of the Imperium's gene pool. They saw individuals not as people, but as collections of genetic traits to be combined and refined. Their use of spice was essential to this project. The heightened awareness it gave them allowed them to make the subtle observations and political moves necessary to keep their program on track. The other memory of the Reverend Mothers provided the long-term perspective needed to manage a project that spanned generations. The Bene Gesserit also used their understanding of human belief systems to their advantage. Through a program called the Missionaria Protectiva, they seeded planets across the galaxy with engineered myths, prophecies, and religious frameworks. These were designed to create a fertile ground for a Bene Gesserit to find shelter or wield influence in times of crisis. On Arrakis, they found that the Fremen had already developed a rich messianic tradition. The Bene Gesserit carefully manipulated these existing beliefs, adding their own elements and prophecies, creating the expectation of a savior from the outer world who would be the son of a Bene Gesserit and would lead them to paradise. This was intended as a form of social control, a way to manage the volatile Fremen population. The Sisterhood's relationship with the spice was one of calculated use. Unlike the guild navigators, They were not completely dependent on it for their primary function. They used it as a tool, a key to unlock specific abilities. They understood its addictive properties and were careful to manage their own consumption. Their goal was control, both of themselves and of the universe around them. The spice was a means to that end, a substance that gave them the vision they needed to guide humanity along the path they had chosen for it. However, their careful plans and long-term vision had a critical flaw. They sought to create a powerful being, the Kwisatz Haderach, but they intended to control him. They saw him as the culmination of their work, a tool that would serve the interests of the sisterhood. They did not fully comprehend the possibility that such a being might have his own agenda, that the power they sought to unleash might be too great for them to contain. Their politics of vision, so carefully managed for so long, had set the stage for a future that not even their reverend mothers could fully anticipate. The spice had given them the ability to see the past, but the future remained a dangerous and uncertain country. Chapter 11. The Great Convention and Canley. In a galaxy governed by powerful, ambitious, and heavily armed noble houses, the potential for constant, destructive warfare was immense. The Imperium could have easily collapsed into a state of perpetual conflict, tearing itself apart in a struggle for resources and power. The primary force holding this chaos in check was a set of rules known as the Great Convention. This ancient agreement, enforced by the combined power of the Emperor and the Spacing Guild, laid down the fundamental laws of warfare, assassination, and political conduct. It did not eliminate violence, but it channeled it into more predictable and less destructive forms. The struggle for spice was the main driver of conflict, and the Great Convention was the rulebook for that struggle. The central tenet of the Great Convention was the prohibition of the use of atomics against human beings. This rule was a direct legacy of the horrors of past wars and the fear of a return to a dark age of indiscriminate destruction. The penalty for violating this article was absolute. The guilty house would face the combined wrath of all the other houses of the Landsraad. Their planet would be destroyed, their family line extinguished. This threat was so severe that it effectively removed nuclear weapons from the strategic calculations of inter-house conflict. It forced the great houses to find other, more conventional and more personal ways to wage war. With the use of mass destruction, weapons forbidden, warfare between houses became a more limited and ritualized affair. It was governed by a complex set of rules concerning formal declarations of war, the treatment of civilians, and the conditions of surrender. These wars were still brutal and deadly, but they were contained. The goal was rarely the complete annihilation of a rival, but rather the achievement of specific political or economic objectives, such as the acquisition of a rival's CHOAM directorships or control of a key trade route. However, the Great Convention also recognized that open warfare was costly and disruptive to the economic activity of the Imperium. It, therefore, provided a legal framework for a more limited and clandestine form of conflict, the War of Assassins. This was a highly formalized system of vendetta, with its own set of rules and protocols. A house could declare a war of assassins against another, which would then be fought by spies, saboteurs, and professional killers. This allowed rivalries to be settled without the expense and disruption of deploying full armies. A key aspect of this system was the concept of plausible deniability. The actions of assassins were supposed to be subtle, their connections to their employers difficult to prove. The use of certain tools and methods was restricted. For example, the use of a lasgun against a target protected by a personal shield was strictly forbidden. The interaction between a lasgun beam and a shield created an explosion of unpredictable magnitude, potentially equivalent to a small atomic device. Such an act would violate the spirit, if not the letter, of the Great Convention's ban on atomics. This rule forced assassins to be more creative, relying on poisons, blades, and other more intimate methods of killing. The formal vendetta or canly, was a way to satisfy honor and pursue grievances without escalating to full-scale war. A declaration of canly was a serious matter, registered with the Landsraad Council. It meant that the two houses were officially in a state of blood feud. The heads of the families and their immediate relatives became legitimate targets. However, even within canly, there were rules. The conflict was supposed to be limited to the principals involved and their agents. It was not a license for indiscriminate slaughter. The spice trade was the primary subject of these conflicts. A house that felt it had been cheated in a CHOAM deal or had its spice harvesting operations sabotaged might declare canly against the suspected perpetrator. The war of assassins would then be fought in the shadows of Arrakis, in the corridors of power on Kaiten, the Imperial capital, and on the home worlds of the feuding houses. Spies would seek to uncover secrets, assassins would seek to eliminate key personnel, and both sides would engage in a constant dance of intrigue and deception. The Great Convention and the rules of canly created a strange kind of stability. They provided a release valve for the intense pressures of the imperial political system. They allowed the great houses to compete, to win and lose fortunes, without threatening the existence of the Imperium itself. The system was brutal and cynical, but it worked. It replaced the chaos of unlimited warfare with the cold, predictable logic of the feud and the balance sheet. The conflict between House Atreides and House Harkonnen was a classic example of these rules in action. The Harkonnens' plan to destroy the Atreides on Arrakis was carefully designed to operate within the framework of the Great Convention. The attack was carried out by Harkonnen troops, disguised in the uniforms of the Emperor's elite Sardaukar. This was intended to create confusion and to hide the Emperor's direct involvement. The Harkonnens used a traitor within the Atreides' own ranks to disable their shields, allowing for a swift and overwhelming conventional attack. They were careful to avoid the use of forbidden weapons. Their goal was to make the destruction of House Atreides look like the result of a legitimate, if brutal, feud, one that the other great houses would not feel compelled to intervene in. The Great Convention, therefore, did not prevent violence. It managed it. It was a system that acknowledged the ruthless nature of power politics and sought to contain it within acceptable bounds. It was a testament to the Imperium's ability to create order out of the chaotic desires of its most powerful members. The law was a cage, and the great houses were the beasts within it, constantly testing the bars, their struggles driven by the intoxicating scent of the spice that lay at the center of their world. Chapter 12. Atreides versus Harkonnen. The transfer of the Arrakis fief from House Harkonnen to House Atreides was one of the pivotal moments in the history of the Imperium. To the casual observer, it appeared to be a great honor for the Atreides, a reward for their loyal service and a recognition of their growing influence. Duke Leto Atreides, a man known for his honor and his ability to inspire fierce loyalty, was being given control of the most valuable asset in the universe. In reality, the transfer was a carefully laid trap, a masterstroke of political maneuvering, designed to destroy a house that had become too popular and too powerful for the Padishah Emperor's comfort. The conflict was not just a battle between two rival houses. It was a demonstration of how the economics of spice could be weaponized. Duke Leto was not naive. He understood that the gift of Arrakis was poisoned. He knew that the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, his ancient and bitter rival, would not give up the planet's immense wealth without a fight. He also suspected the Emperor's involvement. The Emperor's Sardaukar, the elite military force that maintained his throne, were the most formidable fighters in the galaxy. Their training was notoriously brutal, conducted on the prison planet of Salusa Secundus. Duke Leto's own troops, while highly disciplined and loyal, could not match the Sardaukar in open combat. The Emperor's fear was that Leto's popularity in the Landsraad could one day challenge the power of the throne. By placing the Atreides on Arrakis, the Emperor created a situation where they were isolated and vulnerable. The strategic economics of the transfer were designed to bleed the Atreides dry. The Baron Harkonnen had spent the last years of his rule on Arrakis engaging in a policy of skimming. He had pushed the spice harvesting equipment to its limits, foregoing necessary maintenance and repairs to extract the maximum possible profit. In the short term, he left behind a fleet of aging, unreliable harvesters that were prone to breaking down. This meant that the Atreides would have to spend a fortune on repairs and replacements just to maintain the current level of production. Furthermore, the Harkonnens had deliberately brutalized the local population, including the Fremen. They had ruled through fear and exploitation, creating a deep-seated hatred for their off-world masters. This was a calculated move. The Baron knew that Duke Leto's greatest strength was his ability to win the loyalty of his people. By leaving behind a legacy of bitterness and mistrust, the Harkonnens ensured that the Atreides would face a hostile and uncooperative populace. This would further complicate their efforts to meet the demanding spice quotas set by CHOAM. The trap was financial as well as military. The Atreides had to pay an enormous sum to the Spacing Guild for the transport of their entire household, their troops, and their equipment from their homeworld of Caladan to Arrakis. This massive expenditure drained their treasury, leaving them with little reserve to handle the unexpected costs of repairing the damaged harvesting infrastructure. They were caught in a tightening vice. The costs of production were higher than anticipated, and the pressure to meet their quotas was immense. Failure to deliver the required amount of spice would result in heavy fines from CHOAM and a loss of face in the Landsraad, providing the legal and political cover for an attack. Duke Leto's strategy for survival was to try to win over the Fremen. He recognized that they were the key to Arrakis. His lieutenants, men like Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck, were tasked with making contact with the desert people, offering them respect and partnership instead of exploitation. Leto hoped that the Fremen's legendary fighting skills and their deep knowledge of the desert could be turned into an asset, a desert power that could counter the Emperor's Sardaukar. It was a race against time, an attempt to build a new power base before the Harkonnens and the Emperor sprang their trap. The Harkonnen attack, when it came, was swift and devastating. It was a textbook example of the Imperium's rules of clandestine warfare. The Baron used his vast wealth to secretly bribe a key member of the Atreides' inner circle, the Suk Doctor Wellington Yue. The Suk Doctors were conditioned to be incapable of causing harm, a psychological imprinting that was thought to be unbreakable. The Baron, a master of finding and exploiting weakness, found a way to break Yue's conditioning by using his wife as a hostage. Yue disabled the shields of the Atreides fortress at a critical moment, allowing the combined Harkonnen and Sardaukar forces to launch their assault. The real costs of this conflict were paid not by the leaders, but by the ordinary people of Arrakis and the soldiers of the two houses. The battle for the planet was brutal, resulting in thousands of deaths. The intricate system of spice harvesting was thrown into chaos, threatening the stability of the entire galactic economy. The Emperor and the Baron saw this as acceptable collateral damage, a necessary price for the removal of a political rival. They had used the economic levers of the Imperium, the contracts of CHOAM, and the logistics of the Guild to set the stage for a military solution, all while maintaining a veneer of legality under the Great Convention. The fall of House Atreides was a stark lesson in the true nature of power in the spice-fueled empire. Honor and loyalty were admirable qualities, but they were often no match for the cold, ruthless arithmetic of profit and control. Chapter 13. Paul's Leverage. The destruction of House Atreides appeared to be a complete victory for the Harkonnens and the Emperor. Duke Leto was dead, his army was scattered, and his heir, the young Paul Atreides, was presumed to have perished in the desert. The flow of spice was once again under the control of the ruthless Baron Harkonnen. The political threat posed by the Atreides had been neutralized. However, this victory was built on a foundation of sand. In their arrogance, the plotters had overlooked the two most powerful forces on Arrakis, the Fremen and the spice itself. Paul, by surviving in the desert and embracing these forces, would transform the entire political landscape of the Imperium. Paul's survival, along with his Bene Gesserit mother Jessica, was the first unexpected variable. In the deep desert, they found refuge with the Fremen. Here, Paul's unique heritage and training began to blossom in the spice-saturated environment. He was the product of the Bene Gesserit's centuries-long breeding program, a genetic convergence that was intended to produce the Kwisatz Haderach. His father, Duke Leto, had given him a noble's training in strategy and leadership. His mother had trained him in the Bene Gesserit disciplines of observation and control. On Arrakis, the constant, heavy exposure to Melange acted as a catalyst, awakening the latent prescient abilities that were his birthright. His prescience was different from that of the guild navigators. Theirs was a limited vision, a mathematical ability to see the safe paths for physical objects. Paul's was a more profound and terrifying ability. He could see the currents of human action, the nexus points of history, the branching paths of destiny. He saw the terrible purpose that awaited him, a galactic jihad that would be waged in his name, a holy war that would kill billions. This vision horrified him, and he initially sought to avoid it. But he also saw that his only path to survival and revenge was to embrace the power that the spice was unlocking within him. His leverage came from transforming the fundamental equation of power on Arrakis. The Offworlders saw the planet in terms of spice production. The Fremen were a nuisance, the worms were a hazard, and the desert was an obstacle. Paul, under the tutelage of the Fremen, learned to see the planet as an interconnected whole. He saw that the Fremen were not scattered nomads, but a powerful, disciplined military force perfectly adapted to their environment. He saw that the worms were not just monsters, but the sacred source of the spice, beings that could be understood and even controlled. Paul, who took the Fremen name Muad'Dib, became a religious and military leader. He taught the Fremen the weirding way, a Bene Gesserit martial art that made them even more formidable fighters. He used his prescience to guide their attacks, to anticipate the moves of the Harkonnens, and to lead them to victory after victory. He united the disparate Siege tribes into a single, cohesive army. They began a guerrilla war against the Harkonnen occupiers, systematically destroying spice harvesters, disrupting production, and making the cost of occupation impossibly high. The flow of spice, the lifeblood of the Imperium, began to falter. The true masterstroke of Paul's strategy was his control over the spice cycle itself. By undergoing the dangerous Fremen ritual of the spice agony, consuming the raw water of life, he fully awakened his powers and became the Kwisatz Haderach. This transformation gave him a complete understanding of the sandworm life cycle. He now held the ultimate weapon, the knowledge of how to destroy all the spice on Arrakis. He understood the delicate relationship between the sandtrout, the worms, and water. He knew that by destroying a pre-spice mass with water, he could trigger a chain reaction that would render the planet sterile, forever ending the production of melange. This knowledge gave him absolute leverage over the three great powers of the Imperium: the Emperor, the Spacing Guild, and the combined houses of the Landsraad. The Guild was the first to realize the true nature of the threat. Their navigators, blinded by their own limited prescience, could not see Paul clearly. He was a blank spot in their vision of the future, a sign of a power that could rival their own. As Paul's Fremen forces brought spice production to a standstill, the Guild became desperate. Their ability to travel, the source of all their power, was at risk. In the final confrontation, Paul laid his threat bare. He gathered the Emperor, the Baron Harkonnen, and representatives of the Guild to Arrakis. He demonstrated his power by controlling the sandworms, riding them as the Fremen did. Then he revealed his ultimate trump card. He threatened to destroy the spice. It was a threat of mutual assured destruction. He was telling the powers of the Imperium that they could either accept his rule, or he would destroy the foundation of their entire civilization. The Emperor, faced with the loss of the spice, and the Guild's refusal to transport his troops off-planet, had no choice but to abdicate. Paul claimed the Golden Throne, sealing his victory by arranging a political marriage to the emperor's daughter, Princess Irulan. He had transformed the scarcity of spice from a source of wealth for others into the ultimate source of power for himself. He had created a new equilibrium, one in which a single man, backed by the ecological and religious power of a desert planet, held the entire Imperium hostage. The age of Muad'Dib had begun, built on a foundation of prescient vision and the threat of total economic collapse. Chapter 14. Empire by Ration. With Paul Muad'Dib's ascension to the Golden Throne, the entire economic and political structure of the Imperium was fundamentally altered. For centuries, the flow of spice had been managed by a complex interplay between the Emperor CHOAM and the great houses. It was a system based on profit, competition, and a delicate balance of power. Paul replaced this system with a simple, absolute monopoly. He was not just the emperor, he was the sole owner and distributor of Melange. He ruled not by consent or by tradition, but by his absolute control over the substance that everyone in a position of power needed to survive. His was an empire built on the principle of the ration. The first and most dramatic change was the shift in the center of power from the imperial capital of Khitan to Arrakis. The desert planet, for so long treated as a remote resource colony, became the heart of the universe. All power, all wealth, all authority now emanated from the rock fortress of Arrakis. The great houses, accustomed to their intricate political games in the courts of the Landsraad, now had to send their emissaries to the harsh desert world to plead for their allotment of the spice. This geographic shift was a powerful symbol of the new order. The decadent, water-rich world of the old emperor was replaced by the arid, disciplined world of the Fremen. Paul's control over the spice was meticulous and total. The old system of harvesting, with its clumsy, inefficient machinery and its constant danger from sandworms, was largely abandoned. The Fremen, under Paul's direction, became the sole harvesters of the spice. Their methods were far more efficient and sustainable. They understood the rhythms of the desert and could collect the melange with a reverence and care that the off-worlders had never shown. This also meant that the entire process was under the control of people who were fanatically loyal to Paul. There were no more opportunities for smuggling or skimming. Every gram of spice was accounted for. This absolute control allowed Paul and his administrators to use the spice as a precise instrument of political policy. The great houses that had been loyal to the old emperor or that showed signs of dissent found their spice allotments reduced. A cut in the spice ration was a slow, agonizing death sentence for the leaders of a house. Their extended lifespans would begin to shorten, their health would fail, and their addiction would become a constant, tormenting presence. It was a far more effective tool of control than an army. It created a powerful incentive for absolute loyalty. A house that supported Paul and his policies would receive a generous ration, ensuring the longevity and vitality of its leaders. The Spacing Guild was perhaps the most profoundly affected by this new reality. They were completely at Paul's mercy. Their navigators required immense quantities of spice to function, and Paul could turn off the tap at any moment. The Guild's cherished neutrality was shattered. They became, in effect, a transport service for Paul's empire. They had no choice but to ferry his Fremen legions across the galaxy as he consolidated his rule in a bloody jihad. The Guild's power had been based on their monopoly on travel, which in turn was based on their access to spice. Paul now controlled that access, and in doing so, he subjugated the Guild completely. This new system created famines and price shocks, but they were no longer the random byproducts of market forces or Harkonnen greed. They were deliberate acts of statecraft. If a planet or a system defied the will of Muad'Dib, its spice supply could be cut off. This would not only affect the ruling class, but the entire economy. Industries that depended on Guild transport would collapse. The health of anyone with even a mild spice dependency would suffer. It was a form of collective punishment that could bring a rebellious world to its knees without firing a single shot. The governance of demand became a central preoccupation of the new imperial bureaucracy, which was staffed largely by Fremen and loyalists from House Atreides. They maintained detailed records of the spice consumption of every great house, every key institution, and every important individual. These records were used to calculate the precise level of loyalty and to determine the appropriate ration. It was a system of cold bureaucratic control, a universe-wide extension of the Fremen's water discipline. Just as every drop of water was accounted for in the siege, every ounce of spice was now accounted for in the Imperium. However, this system of absolute control had a corrosive effect on the very foundations of the Imperium. The old system, for all its flaws, had a certain dynamism. The competition between the houses, the profit motive of CHOAM, had driven innovation and expansion. Paul's system was static. It was based on fear and dependency. The great houses, stripped of their economic power and their political autonomy, became stagnant and resentful. They chafed under the Fremen yoke, their ancient pride wounded. Paul himself was aware of the terrible nature of his power. His prescient vision showed him the consequences of his actions. The billions who died in the jihad that secured his throne. The stagnation that his rule imposed on the galaxy. He saw himself as a figure of tragedy, a man forced to become a tyrant to prevent an even worse future. He had used his control of the spice to impose a harsh, unyielding peace on the galaxy. But it was the peace of a prison. The ration was his scepter, and addiction was his law. The Imperium was united and orderly, but it had lost its freedom. Its destiny now held in the hands of one man who could see the future and who was trapped by what he saw. Chapter 15. Theology of the Desert. The power of Melange was never purely physical or economic. From the very beginning, its psychoactive properties and its mysterious origins lent it an aura of the sacred. For the Fremen of Arrakis, the spice was the central element of a rich and deeply felt religious tradition. When Paul Atreides became their leader, he did not just seize control of a commodity, he stepped into the role of a prophesied Messiah. The subsequent galactic jihad that was waged in his name was a religious war, and the theology that drove it was born in the sands of the desert. This fusion of religion and politics transformed the spice from a substance of value into an object of worship. The Fremen religion was a syncretic blend of ancient Zen Sunni mysticism and the harsh pragmatism required for survival on Arrakis. They saw the desert as a living entity, a testing ground that weeded out the weak and purified the strong. At the center of their cosmology was Shai-Hulud, the great sandworm. The worm was not just an animal, it was the physical manifestation of God. It was the creator of the spice, the guardian of the desert, and the ultimate arbiter of life and death. To see a worm was a spiritual experience. To ride one was the ultimate act of faith and courage. The spice, as the product of Shai-Hulud, was considered a holy sacrament. It was used in all of their important rituals, most notably in the spice agony that created their reverend mothers. The Fremen believed that the spice opened the mind to the metaphysical realities of the universe. It provided glimpses of the future, a connection to the flow of time that they called the River of God. The eyes of the Ibad, the blue in blue eyes caused by spice saturation, were seen as a sign of spiritual enlightenment, a mark of those who were truly of the desert. Into this fertile religious ground, the Bene Gesserit had planted the seeds of a prophecy through their Missionaria Protectiva. They had engineered a myth that foretold the coming of a Mahdi, a Messiah from the outer world. This figure, the Lisan al-Gaib, or voice from the outer world, would be the son of a Bene Gesserit, would lead the Fremen to victory over their oppressors, and would transform Arrakis into a green paradise. This prophecy was intended as a tool of social control, a way for a stranded Bene Gesserit to find safety and influence. they never intended for it to become real. When Paul Atreides, the son of a Bene Gesserit, survived the desert and demonstrated powers that seemed to fulfill the prophecy, the Fremen's belief was ignited. His prescient abilities were seen not as a genetic trait awakened by the spice, but as divine revelation. His victory over his enemies was interpreted as the fulfillment of a sacred destiny. He became Muad'Dib, the Messiah they had been waiting for. His personal quest for revenge was transformed into a holy crusade. Paul, with his prescient knowledge, understood the immense power of this religious fervor. He saw that he could ride this jihad tide to the imperial throne. He consciously adopted the language and symbols of the Fremen religion, presenting himself as the fulfillment of their deepest hopes. He became a prophet emperor, his political decrees framed as divine commandments. The bureaucracy of his empire became a priesthood, and the distribution of spice became an act of religious dispensation. This new religion, the religion of Muad'Dib, spread from Arrakis across the galaxy in the wake of his conquering Fremen legions. It was a militant, proselytizing faith that swept away the old, decadent religions of the Imperium. It offered a sense of purpose and certainty in a universe that had been governed by cynical power politics. The spice was central to its iconography. It was the holy food that had awakened the Messiah, the substance that gave his Fremen warriors their strength, the symbol of the new age. Pilgrims flocked to Arrakis, now a holy planet, to walk the sands where the prophet had walked and to breathe the spice-laden air. The theology of the desert rationalized and justified the new political order. The absolute monopoly on spice was no longer seen as a form of economic control, but as the rightful stewardship of a sacred substance by God's chosen prophet. The harsh rationing system was interpreted as a test of faith. Loyalty to Muad'Dib was not just a political necessity, it was a religious duty. Dissent was not just treason, it was heresy. This fusion of religious and political power created an empire of unprecedented stability and control. The emperor was not just a secular ruler, he was the head of the church, the object of worship for trillions of followers. However, this power came at a terrible cost. The jihad that brought Paul to power was one of the most destructive wars in human history, killing billions and sterilizing entire planets. The religion that he unleashed was fanatical and intolerant, suppressing dissent and intellectual freedom. Paul himself was a prisoner of this theology. His prescience showed him the bloody consequences of the religious machine he had created, but it also showed him that any attempt to stop it would lead to even greater destruction. He was trapped on a path that he had chosen but could no longer control. The spice had given him the vision to become a god in the eyes of his followers, but it had also shown him the terrible price of that divinity. The desert had taught the galaxy a new faith, one based on the power of a single man and his control over a single sacred substance. The universe had found a new sense of order, but it was the rigid, unyielding order of the zealot. Chapter 16. Leto II and the Golden Path. The empire created by Paul Muad'Dib, for all its power, was ultimately a temporary solution to a deeper problem. Paul's prescience showed him that humanity was on a path to extinction. The stability he had imposed was the stability of stagnation. Over the long term, a civilization that depended on a single resource and a single prescient ruler would become vulnerable, predictable, and easy to destroy. Humanity would eventually be hunted down and wiped out by some unforeseen enemy, or would simply wither and die from a lack of creativity and dynamism. To save humanity from this fate, a far more radical and terrible solution was required. This solution was the Golden Path, and it would be implemented not by Paul, but by his son, Leto II. Leto II was a figure unlike any other in human history. He was pre-born, meaning that he had awakened to full consciousness and his ancestral memories while still in the womb, due to his mother Chani's heavy spice diet. Like his father, he possessed powerful prescient abilities. But unlike Paul, who had shied away from the ultimate sacrifice required to save humanity, Leto chose to embrace it. He saw the same future of extinction that his father had seen, and he conceived of a plan to avert it. A plan of such breathtaking scope and cruelty that it would redefine the meaning of tyranny. Leto's plan required two things: an immensely long life and absolute control over the spice. To achieve the former, he underwent a radical physical transformation. He fused his body with a school of sandtrout, the larval form of the sandworms. Over thousands of years, this fusion would transform him into a new hybrid creature, a human sandworm. His human consciousness would be encased in a nearly invulnerable sandworm body. This would grant him a lifespan of over 3,000 years. The time he calculated was necessary to see his golden path to its conclusion. To achieve the second goal, absolute control over the spice, he took his father's monopoly to its logical extreme. He used his new power as a proto-worm to destroy all other sandworms on Arrakis. He began a slow, deliberate process of terraforming the planet, bringing water to the surface and destroying the desert ecosystem. As the last surviving sandworm, he became the sole producer of the chemical precursors to melange. He controlled not just the supply of spice, but the very possibility of its existence. He then built up a colossal stockpile, a hoard of melange so vast that it could supply the needs of the Imperium for centuries. With his life extended and his spice monopoly absolute, Leto II, the God Emperor, began his long reign. His rule was a deliberate, calculated tyranny designed to teach humanity a lesson it would never forget. He enforced a peace so rigid and stultifying that it bred a deep racial craving for freedom and chaos. He disbanded the great armies of the houses, replacing them with his own all-female military force, the Fish Speakers, who were fanatically loyal to him. He suppressed all forms of technological innovation and space travel, forcing humanity into a state of enforced provincialism. The spice was the primary instrument of his control. He doled it out in carefully measured quantities, rewarding loyalty and punishing even the slightest hint of rebellion with withdrawal. The Spacing Guild, the Bene Gesserit, the great houses, all were reduced to the status of supplicants, their leaders living for centuries on his carefully rationed supply, their long lives a constant reminder of their dependency. His reign was a dark age, a period of galactic confinement, where humanity was trapped in a gilded cage, its leash held by a monstrous tyrant. The purpose of this long, brutal peace was to fundamentally alter human nature. Leto was breeding a new kind of human, one that was invisible to prescient sight. He was forcing humanity to develop a talent for hiding, for surviving in the shadows, for being unpredictable. He was also creating a deep, explosive desire for expansion. For millennia, he kept humanity bottled up, its exploratory urges frustrated. He knew that when the pressure was finally released, the explosion would be unstoppable. The Golden Path was a lesson in the dangers of predictability. Leto had seen that a species that could be fully understood by a prescient oracle could also be trapped and destroyed. His father, Paul, had tried to guide humanity by showing it the future. Leto sought to save humanity by hiding the future from it. His goal was to create a species that could never again be caught in the net of a single, all-seeing tyrant, not even one as well-intentioned as himself. At the end of his long reign, Leto allowed himself to be assassinated. His death was the trigger for the next phase of his plan. The great sandworm body disintegrated in a river. The sandtrout that composed it were released back into the newly arid environment of Arrakis, now called Arrakis. The worms would return, and with them, the spice cycle. His vast stockpile of melange was scattered, breaking his monopoly and creating a new economic reality. Most importantly, his death shattered the cage he had built. The pent-up energy of thousands of years of repression was released in an event known as the scattering. Humanity exploded out from the known universe into the vast, uncharted regions of space. They fled the memory of the tyrant, driven by a deep, instinctual need to spread out, to diversify, to ensure that no single power could ever again control the destiny of the entire species. The Golden Path was complete. Leto II had used his absolute control over spice to freeze history, and in doing so, he had guaranteed that humanity would have a future that was free, chaotic, and ultimately unknowable. Chapter 17. After the Tyrant. The death of Leto II, the God Emperor, was the most significant event in human history since the Butlerian Jihad. His 3,500-year reign had created a society of enforced stability, a universe-spanning prison designed to teach a specific lesson. His assassination shattered that prison, and the consequences were immediate and explosive. The era that followed, known as the Scattering, was a time of unprecedented change, chaos, and expansion. The old institutions that had been built around the spice monopoly were broken, and humanity, for the first time in millennia, was truly free and rudderless. The most immediate effect of Leto's death was the release of his massive spice stockpile. For centuries, he had used his hoard to control the galaxy through addiction. Now, this immense wealth was suddenly available, its control fragmented. This broke the absolute economic monopoly that had been the foundation of his power. Spice was still valuable, but it was no longer the sole province of a single divine ruler. New markets emerged, and new powers rose to control the distribution of the remaining hoard. CHOAM, a shadow of its former self during Leto's reign, was reborn in a new, more complex form, as multiple factions vied for control of the spice trade. Simultaneously, the planet Arrakis, formerly Arrakis, began its slow return to a desert state. The death of Leto's sandworm body released a new generation of sandtrout into the environment. As they had done millennia before, they began to encapsulate the planet's surface water, slowly killing the lush ecosystem that Leto had created. With the return of the desert came the return of the great sandworms. The spice cycle, dormant for thousands of years, was reborn. Arrakis once again became the source of new melange, ensuring that the substance would continue to shape the destiny of humanity. However, the most profound consequence was the scattering itself. Driven by a deep, genetically ingrained horror of the kind of centralized control Leto had represented, humanity fled the worlds of the old Imperium. Trillions of people, in countless ships, pushed out into the unknown voids between galaxies. They were seeking not just new worlds to colonize, but a future free from the suffocating omniscience of a prescient ruler. This was the ultimate success of Leto's Golden Path. He had turned humanity into a species that would never again put all of its eggs in one basket. This great diaspora fundamentally changed the balance of power. The old Imperium, the collection of worlds centered around Arrakis and the traditional great houses, became just one small corner of a much larger and more complex human universe. New civilizations rose in the far-flung reaches of the Scattering, developing their own technologies, cultures, and forms of government, many of them completely unknown to the old world. The return flows from the Scattering began centuries later, bringing new and often hostile forces back into the sphere of the old Imperium. Among the most powerful of these were the honored matres, a violent, matriarchal society that had developed in the uncharted territories. They were a twisted reflection of the Bene Gesserit, but they ruled through sexual domination and raw, destructive power, not subtle manipulation. Their return plunged the old Imperium into a new era of conflict. The institutions that had once defined the Spice Age were forced to adapt or perish. The Spacing Guild, having lost its absolute monopoly during the chaos of the Scattering, now had to compete with other forms of interstellar travel. Their navigators were still essential for certain kinds of long-distance travel, but their power was greatly diminished. They were no longer the sole gatekeepers of the universe. The Bene Gesserit, having survived Leto's reign through careful, long-term planning, found themselves facing a new and existential threat from the honored matres. The sisterhood had to abandon its traditional role as secret manipulators and become an active, open player in the struggle for survival. Their relationship with the spice also changed. They became the new masters of Arrakis, controlling the reborn sandworms and the flow of Melange. They used this power not to rule the galaxy, but to defend their order and preserve what was left of the old ways. The scattering had created a universe that was far larger, more diverse, and more dangerous than the one Leto II had inherited. The spice was still a vital commodity, sought after for its life-extending and mind-enhancing properties. But it was no longer the single hinge of history. It was one powerful element in a much more complex and unpredictable equation. Leto's tyranny had succeeded in its ultimate goal. He had used his monopoly of time and spice to shatter all monopolies, creating a future for humanity that was chaotic, violent, and full of terrible risks, but a future that was, for the first time, truly its own. The lesson of the tyrant had been learned, and the price of that lesson was an eternity of struggle. Chapter 18. Substitution and the Limits of Control. Throughout the long history of the Imperium, the absolute dependence on a single source for Melange was a source of constant anxiety for the great powers. The idea of creating a substitute for the spice, of breaking the monopoly of Arrakis, was a recurring dream. If Melange could be synthesized in a laboratory, the entire political and economic structure of the universe would be transformed. The power of the Spacing Guild, the value of the Arrakis fief, the very foundation of the Imperial economy, all of it would be rendered obsolete. For this reason, the search for an artificial spice was pursued with great effort and secrecy by various factions over the millennia. Every attempt, however, ended in failure. The first major and most infamous attempt at spice synthesis was Project Amal, an early initiative by the Tleilaxu. The Bene Gesserit were masters of genetic engineering, capable of creating Gola clones from dead cells and a host of other biological wonders in their axolotl tanks. They saw the spice monopoly as the ultimate challenge to their bioengineering prowess. They believed that any substance with a biological origin could be replicated and improved upon. They poured immense resources into analyzing the chemical structure of Melange and attempting to reproduce it. The initial results seemed promising. The Tleilaxu succeeded in creating a substance that mimicked many of the properties of real Melange. Their artificial spice, produced in their advanced laboratories, provided the same geriatric effects, extending the lifespan of those who consumed it. It even produced the characteristic blue in blue eyes. For a time, it seemed that they had succeeded in breaking the Arrakis monopoly. They presented their creation to the great powers of the Imperium, promising a new era of spice, abundance, and freedom from the whims of whoever controlled the desert planet. However, the Tleilaxu's creation had a fatal flaw, one that was not immediately apparent. While it replicated the physiological effects of spice, it failed to replicate its most important property. It did not grant prescience. A Spacing Guild navigator who attempted to use the artificial spice to navigate a highliner found that his vision of the future was gone. The safe paths through space-time remained hidden. The highliner and all its crew and passengers were lost in a catastrophic fold space accident. This disaster proved that the spice was more than just a collection of chemicals. It was a substance with a metaphysical dimension, a key that unlocked a potential within the human mind that could not be accessed by a mere chemical replica. Its true power was tied to its unique origin in the life cycle of the sandworms of Arrakis. It was a product of a vast and complex ecological system, not something that could be cooked up in a vat. The failure of Project Amal was a powerful lesson in the limits of technology. It demonstrated that some natural processes were too complex and too subtle to be artificially duplicated. This failure had profound consequences. It reinforced the sanctity and uniqueness of Arrakis. It proved, once and for all, that there was no technological shortcut to escape the planet's monopoly. The only way to control the spice was to control the desert. This realization entrenched the existing power structures even further. The fight for Arrakis became even more desperate, as it was now clear that there was no alternative prize. In the era after the scattering, new attempts were made. The honored Matres, in their war against the Bene Gesserit, destroyed Arrakis, burning its surface to a cinder and killing all the sandworms. This act seemed to spell the final end of Melange. For a time, the galaxy had to rely on the dwindling stockpiles that remained. However, the Bene Gesserit had foreseen this possibility. They had managed to smuggle a single sandworm off the planet before its destruction. They transported this worm to their own secret homeworld, a desert planet they called Chapter House. There, they began the long and arduous process of recreating the Arrakis ecosystem. They were attempting not to synthesize the spice, but to transplant the entire ecological cycle that produced it. This was a project of immense scale and difficulty, a testament to their long-term vision and their deep understanding of the connection between the worm and its environment. Their goal was to turn their own planet into a new Arrakis, ensuring the survival of both the spice and their own order. The enduring lesson of all these efforts was one of ecological dependency. The story of Melange was not the story of a commodity that could be manufactured and controlled through purely economic or technological means. It was the story of a substance that was fundamentally linked to a specific place and a specific form of life. The Imperium's greatest strength, its ability to travel the stars and manage a galactic economy, was built on a foundation of absolute biological fragility. The attempts to create a substitute or to control the spice through brute force were all, in the end, a failure to understand the desert's primary law, that life is a complex, interconnected system. To have the spice, one had to have the sandworms. To have the sandworms, one had to have the desert. And to have the desert, one had to accept its harsh, unforgiving conditions. Humanity could not have the gifts of Arrakis without also accepting its limits. This was the ultimate truth that the spice taught the galaxy. Control is an illusion, and the most powerful forces in the universe are not those that can be manufactured, but those that must be respected. Epilogue: the enduring substance. The history of the Imperium is a history written in sand and spice. For more than 20,000 years, from the rise of the Spacing Guild to the chaos of the Scattering and beyond, this single, irreplaceable substance shaped the course of human destiny. It was the catalyst for the creation of a unified galactic empire, the fuel for its economy, the source of its political conflicts, and the object of its deepest religious yearnings. Melange was the thread that bound biology, politics, and culture into a single complex tapestry. Its story offers a profound and enduring lesson on the nature of power and dependency. At its core, the history of the spice is a story about the tension between human ambition and natural limits. Humanity, in its quest to conquer the stars, sought a tool that would grant it mastery over the vastness of space. Melange provided that tool, but it came with a non-negotiable price: absolute dependence on the unique and fragile ecosystem of a single desert planet. The great powers of the Imperium spent millennia fighting to control this resource, believing that control of the spice would give them control of their own destiny. They built vast institutions: CHOAM, the Guild, the Imperial throne itself, all designed to manage and exploit this monopoly. Yet, this entire structure was built on a biological foundation that none of them truly understood or respected, save for the native Fremen. They saw Arrakis as a factory, not as a living world. Their attempts to impose order on the desert were always temporary and always failed to grasp the deeper ecological truth. The sandworms, the creatures they feared as monsters and obstacles, were in fact the source and stewards of the very wealth they craved. The water they took for granted on their homeworlds was the deadliest poison on the planet that sustained them. This fundamental misunderstanding was the critical flaw in the heart of their empire. The spice also taught a powerful lesson about the nature of vision. The prescience it granted was the Imperium's greatest asset, allowing for safe space travel and creating the predictability on which a galactic economy could be built. But this vision was also a trap. The guild navigators became prisoners of their limited mathematical foresight, unable to comprehend the chaotic power of human will. Paul Muad'Dib saw the future with terrible clarity, but he became enslaved by the path he saw, forced to become a tyrant to prevent a worse fate. His son, Leto II, used his perfect vision to impose a 3,000-year tyranny, all to teach humanity the terrible lesson that a species that can be perfectly predicted can be perfectly controlled and ultimately destroyed. The spice opened the eye, but it also showed that to see everything is to be blinded. In the end, the most enduring legacy of the spice was the one forged by the Golden Path. Leto II used his absolute monopoly to shatter all monopolies. He taught humanity, through millennia of suffering and confinement, to fear predictability, to cherish chaos, and to spread so far and wide that no single power could ever again hold the entire species hostage. The scattering was the final, explosive fulfillment of the spice's promise. It did not lead to a peaceful, orderly universe, but to one that was fragmented, dangerous, and diverse. It created a humanity that was resilient, precisely because it was no longer unified. The spice itself endures. After the destruction of Arrakis, a new cycle begins on another world. Humanity's need for it, for the long life and heightened awareness it provides, continues. But it is no longer the single fulcrum of the universe. It is one element among many in a vastly expanded and more complex human story. The central lesson of Arrakis has been learned. To build an empire on a single, irreplaceable substance is to build a magnificent but fragile prison. The desert taught the galaxy that true survival lies not in control, but in adaptation, not in unity, but in diversity, and not in seeing the future, but in having the freedom to create one that is truly unknown.